The desert wind whispered through the canyons, carrying with it memories long buried, memories of a life that once hung in the balance. Years had passed since the fateful day when a young Apache girl, fierce yet fragile, had been swept into danger, and the cowboy, stoic, rugged, and unyielding, had saved her with nothing but courage and instinct. Those moments had faded into legend in their small frontier town, tales shared in hushed voices around campfires and saloons, yet for both of them, the memory had never truly left. The cowboy, whose hands bore the scars of countless battles and whose eyes carried the loneliness of a life spent wandering, had never known that the girl he saved had grown into a woman whose heart had never stopped searching for him. And now, as the sun rose in brilliant shades of orange and gold over the horizon, she rode back into town, her horse's hooves echoing the heartbeat of destiny itself. Her eyes, as sharp as the eagle that had once guided her through the wilds, scanned the familiar streets, each building a chapter of a story she had only ever lived in fragments of memory and whispered dreams. She dismounted with a grace that spoke of years of hardship and survival, yet there was a softness in her gaze, a quiet hope that the cowboy she remembered still walked among the shadows of this place. The town seemed unchanged, as if frozen in time to preserve the memory of that day when fate had entwined their lives forever. She paused by the old wooden fence where the wildflowers had once bent beneath the weight of a summer wind, and she whispered the words she had rehearsed countless times in the silent nights. "Remember me, cowboy." The words carried across the empty street, a fragile yet defiant echo of a promise made years ago. The townsfolk watched in curiosity, sensing a storm of emotion about to unfold, unaware that history itself had returned to this very moment. Inside the saloon, the cowboy's hand paused mid-motion as he poured a glass of whiskey, sensing a presence that tugged at the edges of his memory. When their eyes met, the years melted away, leaving only the intensity of recognition, the fire of shared history, and a question that needed no words. Had the universe truly brought them back together, or was this a dream too vivid to ignore? She took a step forward, and with each movement, the stories of her journey, the hardships, the battles, the nights under the stars, flowed unspoken between them. The cowboy, feeling a stir of emotions long buried beneath the grit and dust of life, could only nod slowly, his voice catching as he managed, "It's really you? After all these years?" She smiled, a mixture of relief and determination, and replied, "I've come back to marry you." The saloon seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls themselves were eager to witness the reunion that destiny had scripted. And as she stepped closer, the narrative of their lives began to unfold once again, weaving a tale of courage, love, and a bond that not even time could sever. The chapter closed not with an ending, but with the promise of a journey that would test their hearts, challenge their courage, and reveal that sometimes the love you fight to remember is the very love that saves you. The streets of the frontier town were quiet that morning, the sun climbing slowly over the dusty rooftops, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of the past. The cowboy watched from the doorway of the saloon, his heart pounding in a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. The Apache girl, the same one he had saved so long ago, stood before him like a vision out of time, her presence awakening a torrent of memories he thought he had buried beneath grit, solitude, and whiskey. Her eyes, dark and unwavering, held the fire of the desert and the sorrow of a life lived in exile, yet they softened when they met his gaze, and in that moment, every danger he had faced, every lonely night, every scar etched into his hands and soul seemed to converge on this one truth: she had returned. She walked slowly toward him, her boots crunching on the sun-baked dirt, each step a testament to the years she had survived without him, each breath a silent declaration that the love he thought was lost had never faded. The townsfolk peeked from windows and alleyways, whispering among themselves, yet no one dared intervene. They could feel the electricity in the air, the collision of destiny and memory that made even the simplest glance between them feel like a lifetime of stories compressed into one heartbeat. The cowboy swallowed hard, his throat dry as the wind tugged at his coat, and stirred the tumbleweeds across the empty street. He wanted to speak, to tell her all the things that had stayed locked in his chest for years, but the words caught in his throat, heavy with emotion. And instead, he let his eyes convey what speech could not: the relief, the longing, and the depth of a bond forged under fire and shadow. She finally stopped before him, her hand brushing the edge of her scarf as if to anchor herself in reality. "I promised I would come back," she said softly, her voice carrying across the silent street. "And I've kept that promise." There was a quiet strength in her words, but beneath it, he sensed vulnerability, a tremor that spoke of nights spent dreaming of this very reunion, of the courage it had taken to cross mountains and rivers, plains and storms, just to see him again. The cowboy reached out, instinctively, his calloused hand hovering near hers, not daring yet to touch, afraid that even the slightest movement might shatter this fragile moment of destiny. Memories flooded him, her terrified gasp when the outlaw had chased her into the canyon, the desperate leap from the cliff where he had caught her just in time, the nights they had spent by the campfire, sharing stories, dreams, and silence that spoke louder than any words. He remembered the fear in her eyes, the strength in her spirit, and the moment he realized that saving her was not just about her life. It had been about saving a part of himself he didn't even know he had lost. Now, all those years later, the girl he saved had returned as a woman of fire and resolve, and with her return came a challenge he had never expected: to open his heart again, to risk the vulnerability he had sworn never to expose. The Apache girl stepped closer, her voice firmer this time, as if commanding the universe itself. "I didn't come back for anything less than forever. I came back to be why. Ours, to marry you." The words hung in the air like a spell, filling the silence with possibility and fear alike. The cowboy's eyes softened, and a slow, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "After all these years, you still amaze me," he murmured, the gravel in his voice betraying the depth of his emotion. She smiled in return, the sunlight catching the streaks of gold in her dark hair, and in that smile, he saw hope, love, and the promise of a life that might finally belong to them both. But as the town seemed to exhale with their reunion, shadows moved at the edges of their awareness, figures from the past who had once threatened to tear them apart. Old rivals, dangerous men who had not forgotten the day he had saved her, were still out there, waiting, watching, ready to seize any opportunity to rewrite fate with violence and greed. The cowboy tightened his jaw, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, and he knew that their love, though rekindled, would not be free of trials. Every step she had taken to return to him had been a test, and the true test was only beginning. "Before we can think of forever," he said quietly, taking her hand at last, "we must survive the shadows that followed you home." She nodded, her grip firm, unwavering, and he saw the warrior she had become. The girl he had saved was now a woman capable of standing by his side against any storm. Together, they walked through the streets, the wind at their backs, knowing that the journey ahead would demand courage, trust, and a love stronger than either time or danger. And as they approached the horizon, the camera, or in a video adaptation the viewer, could feel the pulse of anticipation, the promise of adventure, and the inevitability of a love that had been written into the stars. It was a moment to pause, to breathe, and to witness the magic of destiny in them. Ocean. And for those watching, this was only the beginning. If you want to see how the cowboy and the Apache girl face the trials that lie ahead, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because their story is far from over, and every chapter promises heart, danger, and a love that refuses to fade. The sun had dipped low behind the jagged mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the town, when the cowboy and the Apache girl realized that their reunion, as miraculous as it was, had drawn attention they could not ignore. The streets, once quiet in the glow of afternoon heat, now hummed with an underlying tension, whispers of old grudges and unfinished business carried by the wind. Every glance from the townsfolk, every flicker of movement in the alleyways seemed to speak of eyes that had watched them, waiting for a chance to strike. The cowboy, whose instincts had saved lives more times than he cared to count, felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the silent warning that danger was near. Yet this time, he was not alone. Her hand in his gave him a renewed sense of purpose, a fire that reminded him of why he had survived so many battles, to protect her, to be worthy of the love she now offered without hesitation. As they walked through the dusty streets, memories of the past intertwined with the present. He recalled the first time he had seen her, her small, trembling form cornered by the bandits who had underestimated the courage of a girl and the resolve of a cowboy. He remembered how he had risked his life without a second thought, lifting her from danger and carrying her into the safety of the wilderness, where they had shared nights under the stars, talking of dreams too big for their small world. And now, years later, that same courage shimmered in her eyes. She had faced dangers on her journey back, storms, treacherous paths, and men who sought to exploit her. Vulnerability. But she had not wavered. The resilience in her soul matched the strength of his own, creating a bond that was more than love. It was destiny. But destiny, as they would soon discover, was never without challenge. As they approached the edge of town, the sound of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels reached their ears. From the shadows of the canyon came a group of riders, faces masked with malice and intent. These were not strangers. He recognized them instantly. The same men who had haunted the town years ago, men who had sworn vengeance against anyone who dared defy them. Their eyes, cold and calculating, were fixed on the Apache girl, and in that instant, the cowboy knew that the past had returned, not just in memory, but in danger. Without a word, he stepped in front of her, positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. His hand hovered near the holster of his revolver, but it wasn't just his gun that spoke of protection. It was the unwavering stance, the calm yet deadly aura of a man who had faced death and emerged unbroken. The Apache girl, far from intimidated, stood beside him, her own strength radiating in every line of her body. Though she carried no weapon, the fire in her eyes made it clear that she was not a damsel to be rescued, but a partner in the battle that was about to unfold. The leader of the riders, a man whose face bore scars from battles past, sneered. "So you've returned, little girl," he spat, not realizing that the girl was no longer the frightened child they had once tried to harm. "And this cowboy thinks he can protect you again?" His voice dripped with arrogance, but beneath it was fear, the fear of underestimating a bond forged in fire and years apart. The cowboy's jaw tightened, and he spoke slowly, every word deliberate. "She's not the girl you remember, and I'm not the man you once thought you could scare." The tension between them was palpable, a taut wire ready to snap. A sudden movement, a blur of motion, and chaos erupted. The riders charged, aiming to intimidate, but the cowboy's experience and her instinctive agility made them formidable opponents. Dust rose in swirling clouds as punches were thrown. Revolvers fired, and the Apache girl demonstrated skills he hadn't even realized she possessed. She dodged, ducked, and struck with precision, showing him that the girl he had once protected had become a woman capable of defending herself and standing as an equal by his side. Every move, every calculated step, built a narrative not only of survival, but of love tested in the crucible of danger. By the time the fight ended, the riders lay scattered, retreating back into the shadows from which they came. The town exhaled, the tension dissolving like heat over the desert, but the cowboy and the Apache girl knew this was only the beginning. Threats from the past would continue to follow, and the path to a future together would be paved with trials far greater than these initial confrontations. Yet, in that moment, as they stood side by side, breathing heavily but unbroken, there was a profound realization. Their bond was stronger than fear, stronger than time, and even stronger than the enemies who sought to tear them apart. As they walked back through the silent streets, the Apache girl spoke, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and determination. "I came back to be with you, no matter the cost. But if we're going to survive, we have to face the truth. Our past is not done with us yet." The cowboy nodded, a silent promise forming in the depths of his eyes. "Then we face it together. Every fight, every challenge, side by side." The weight of their commitment hung in the air, a promise not just to each other, but to destiny itself. For those watching their story unfold, it was impossible not to feel the intensity, the danger, and the undeniable pull of love that refused to be silenced. Every moment, every heartbeat, every triumph and setback was a reminder that life's greatest rewards often came to those willing to risk everything. And so, as viewers witnessed this chapter of courage, resilience, and passion, the message was clear: the adventure was far from over, and the next chapter promised even greater trials, deeper revelations, and a love that would defy the odds. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe now, and stay with them as the story unfolds, because every twist and turn is a lesson in heart, survival, and the power of destiny's embrace. Night fell slowly over the land, wrapping the desert in a blanket of stars so vast it felt like the sky itself was listening. The cowboy led the Apache girl away from the town, knowing the streets were no longer safe. Not after the fight, not after the past had shown its teeth. They rode side by side through familiar trails, the moonlight painting silver lines across the sand, the rhythm of the horses' hooves echoing like a heartbeat shared between them. Silence followed them, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything they hadn't yet said. Every mile pulled them farther from the town and deeper into the truth they could no longer avoid. They stopped near an old canyon, a place the cowboy remembered well. It was where he had hidden years ago after saving her, where the world had seemed small and survivable for the first time in his life. He dismounted and helped her down, his touch careful, reverent, as if she were both memory and miracle. A fire was built quickly, sparks rising into the night like prayers, and for a long moment they simply sat across from each other, faces lit by flame, shadows dancing between them. It was she who broke the silence. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "H." Her voice steady, but carrying a weight that made his chest tighten. "But you didn't see what came after." Her eyes reflected the fire, but what burned behind them was something deeper. Years of survival, loss, and strength forged through pain. She began to speak of her journey after they were forced apart, of being taken back to her people, of learning to fight not just with her hands, but with her spirit, of burying loved ones, of being hunted because of who she was and what she represented. She told him how his memory had been the one thing that never broke, the one promise she held on to when everything else was stripped away. The cowboy listened without interruption, fists clenched, jaw tight, each word carving itself into him like a fresh scar. He realized then that saving her had not ended her suffering. It had merely begun her becoming. "I thought about you every day," she continued, "not as a fantasy, as a reason. I told myself that if a man like you existed in this world, then it was worth surviving it." Her confession hit him harder than any bullet ever had. He had lived his life believing he was nothing more than a wandering gun, a man shaped by violence and loss. Yet here she was telling him he had been her hope. He finally spoke, his voice low and raw. "I didn't come after you because I thought you were safer without me. I thought my life, my enemies, they'd destroy you." She stood then, stepping into the firelight, her presence commanding, unafraid. "You were wrong," she said softly. "You were never the danger. You were the light." In that moment, the distance between them vanished. Years, fear, guilt, all of it collapsed as he pulled her into his arms, holding her like he had once held her on the edge of death. Only now she was strong, unbroken, choosing him freely. But the desert does not let secrets rest forever. As dawn approached, the sound of distant riders carried on the wind. The enemies they had faced were not finished. Worse still, she revealed the final truth she had carried alone. The men hunting her were not just criminals. They were backed by powerful forces, men who would never stop until she was silenced or controlled. And marrying the cowboy was not just love. It was defiance, a declaration that she would no longer run. The cowboy looked out toward the horizon, the coming sun illuminating the lines of a decision already made. "Then they'll have to come through me," he said, "and through everything I am." Their love was no longer just personal. It was a stand against fear, against erasure, against a world that had tried to decide their fate for them. As they mounted their horses and rode toward what awaited them, one truth was undeniable. This story was no longer about rescue. It was about unity, choice, and the courage to claim happiness in a world determined to deny it. And for everyone watching this story unfold, this chapter marks a turning point. Love has been confessed, truths revealed, and the stakes raised higher than ever. If you feel the fire of this journey, if you want to see how destiny tests those brave enough to choose it, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will change everything. The desert had a way of revealing truths at the moment one least desired them, and as the cowboy and the Apache woman rode deeper into the vast openness beyond the canyon, the land itself seemed to sense the storm that was coming. The sky stretched wide and merciless, a hard blue by day and a bruised purple by night, as if the heavens were bracing for what destiny was about to demand. Every mile forward felt heavier than the last, not because of exhaustion, but because both of them understood now that love had crossed into a territory where it would no longer be tested by words or promises, but by sacrifice. The enemies who hunted her were no longer rumors or distant shadows. They were real, organized, relentless, and fueled by the kind of power that did not forgive defiance. The cowboy felt it in his bones, the same instinct that had warned him before gunfire erupted in his past, the same instinct that told him this time would be different. This time, there would be no running. They made camp near a dry riverbed as dusk bled into night, the air tense and electric. The Apache woman sat across from him, sharpening a blade she had carried for years, its metal worn but deadly, a symbol of everything she had endured. In the firelight, she no longer looked like the girl he had once carried to safety. She looked like a leader, a survivor, a woman who had already paid the price of living in a world that tried to erase her. He realized then that marrying her was not just an act of love. It was a declaration of war against the forces that believed they could own her fate. "They won't stop," she said calmly, her voice steady but filled with certainty. "They never do." He nodded, loading his revolver with deliberate precision. "Then neither will we." The attack came before dawn, swift and merciless. Hooves thundered across the sand, rifles cracked the silence, and fire erupted in every direction. The cowboy moved with the lethal grace of a man who had been preparing for this moment his entire life, placing himself between her and the chaos without hesitation. Bullets tore through the night air, dust and smoke blinding, but still they stood their ground. She fought beside him, not behind him, moving with the instincts of someone who had learned survival the hard way. In the midst of the violence, something shifted inside him. This was no longer about protection alone, it was about partnership, about trusting her strength as much as she trusted his. Destiny was not testing whether they loved each other. It was testing whether they could stand together when the world demanded blood. When the dust finally settled, the desert was silent once more. But the cost was written across the ground and etched into their bodies. Wounded but alive, they stood amid the aftermath, breathing hard, hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just been faced. The cowboy looked at her, blood on his sleeve, pain burning in his side, and understood with devastating clarity that love like this was never meant to be safe. It was meant to be chosen again and again, even when it hurt, even when it demanded everything. She stepped toward him, pressing her forehead to his, her voice breaking for the first time. "If this is the price," she whispered, "I will pay it, but I won't walk away." He closed his eyes, holding her as the sun rose over the desert, painting the land gold as if blessing their survival. Yet even as victory lingered, they knew the final reckoning was still ahead. Powerful men would not forgive humiliation, and the blood spilled that night would echo far beyond the desert. The cowboy made a choice then, not just to marry her, but to confront the source of the threat itself, to end it once and for all, even if it meant facing his own past and everything he had tried to outrun. Love had changed the rules. It was no longer about surviving alone. It was about building a future worth bleeding for. As this chapter closes, one truth stands unshaken. When destiny demands blood, only those bound by purpose and love endure. And if you feel the intensity of this journey, if this story has pulled you into its fire, don't walk away now. Subscribe to the channel because the final chapter is coming, and it will decide everything: love, freedom, and whether destiny truly keeps its promises. The desert was quiet in the way it only becomes after violence is past, when even the wind seems to move with respect for what has been lost and what has been claimed. The cowboy stood at the edge of a ridge overlooking the land he had once wandered without purpose. The sunrise spilling gold across the dust and stone as if the earth itself were offering forgiveness. Behind him, the Apache woman slept lightly near the dying embers of their fire, her breathing steady, her presence grounding in a way nothing else ever had. This was the morning after destiny's final demand, the moment when survival turned into choice and choice into forever. The enemies who had hunted her were gone, defeated not just by force, but by the refusal of two souls to be broken or owned. The world had tried to decide their ending and failed. When she woke, she joined him at the ridge, her gaze following his across the vast horizon. There were no words at first, because words felt too small for what they had endured. The past no longer haunted them the way it once had. It stood behind them now, acknowledged, conquered. She reached for his hand, and he felt the quiet certainty in her touch. This was not a promise made in fear or desperation, but in clarity. "We survived," she said finally, not as a question, but as a statement of truth. He nodded slowly. "No," he replied, turning to face her fully. "We chose each other. That's what saved us." They returned to the town not as fugitives or strangers, but as something unshakable. The townsfolk gathered, sensing that what they were witnessing was more than a wedding. It was a reckoning, a restoration of balance. Under the open sky, with the desert as their witness, the cowboy took her hands and looked into the eyes that had once pleaded for help and now burned with sovereignty and love. He spoke without flourish, without fear. "I don't offer you safety," he said. "I offer you truth, loyalty, and a life I will defend with everything I am." She answered with a smile that held both gentleness and steel. "I don't ask to be protected," she said. "I choose to stand with you. Always." When they were joined, it felt as though the land itself exhaled. The wind moved through the sagebrush, the sun climbed higher, and something ancient and unbroken settled into place. This was not a fairy tale ending. It was a victory earned through pain, resilience, and courage. The cowboy who once believed he was only good for saving others learned that he was worthy of being loved. The Apache girl, who was once rescued, proved that she was never defined by her vulnerability, but by her strength and choice. Together they rewrote the meaning of destiny, not as something that happens to you, but as something you claim. As the day faded into evening and the celebration quieted, they rode out together once more, not to run, but to begin. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was theirs. and written into the dust behind them were the footprints of two lives that had finally aligned, not by chance but by will. Love had returned, not as a memory, but as a future, and to everyone who has followed this journey, from loss to hope, from rescue to partnership, remember this. Some stories stay with us because they remind us of what is possible when we choose courage over fear and love over isolation. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in destiny again, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. More powerful stories are waiting, and the journey never truly ends.